Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on this occasion, as well as those joining us on the C-SPAN network. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices of whatever sort have been silenced or turned off, simply to avoid any unnecessary distractions. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference following the presentations today. Leading our discussion and welcoming our special guests is Frederico Bartels. Fred is our policy analyst for defense budgeting in the Center for National Defense here at the Heritage Foundation. Please join in welcoming him. Fred?
Thanks, John. And thanks, everyone, for making the time to come over here in this first day of Congress being back in town, which I assume is a busy time for everyone. First, I'm just going to introduce our guests and then explain to everyone a little bit. If you're here by accident and you don't know what BRAC is, I'm just going to give you like a 2-minute introduction in it to make sure that the audience knows as well, and we're all talking about the same thing. So to my left is Lucien Niemeyer. He's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment at DoD. Lucien served as a professional staff member on the Armed Services Committee, and while at SASC, he provided oversight for the 2005 BRAC round. He is a retired Air Force officer with active duty and Air National Guard services. To his left is Anthony Principi. He was the chairman of the 2005 BRAC Commission, and from 2001 to 2005, he was the secretary of VA. Tony has multiple stints in the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And to his left is Andrew Hunter. Hunter is a senior fellow at the International Security Program and director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at CSIS. He served as senior executive at DoD and as chief of staff to both Ash Carter and Frank Kendall while they were working at ATNL. He also served as a professional staff member at the House Armed Services Committee before all of that in CSIS. So BRAC was created as a political compromise between the executive and the legislative branches to close and realign domestic military bases. The power to close military bases is understood as part of the powers of the commander-in-chief. So initially, the executive was able to determine alone which bases would be closed. This caused a legislative pushback as it affected their districts. And in 1977, Congress was able to stop all closures through highly visible reporting requirements. This reporting requirements served as a practical prohibition on base closures. They were only overcome with the creation of BRAC. A BRAC round involves establishing objective criteria for the evaluation of possible closures. DoD develops a list of recommended actions, which are later assessed by an independent 9-person commission before going to the President and Congress for approval. The first round of BRAC took place in 1988, followed by 3 consecutive rounds in 91, 93, and 95. The 5th and last round took place in 2005. Now, 12 years later, authorizing a new round of BRAC is part of the political discussion. The need is based on estimates that we currently have over 20% of excess infrastructure, and the resources dedicated to the upkeep of these bases could be better allocated somewhere else in the defense budget. And to talk about why we need a BRAC now, Secretary Niemeyer is going to be able to inform us on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Fred. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here at Heritage on this important topic, and one that's actually pretty timely. For those of us who watch the ongoings of Congress from day to day, we know that the Senate is about to consider the FY19 Defense Authorization Act on the Senate floor. And we do have an amendment pending from both the chairman and the ranking member that would provide for an authorization of a round of base realignment closure. So it's really important to be able to talk to you all, to take questions, and to be able to talk about why we believe the department is in a good place right now, in a good position to request an authorization for base realignment closure and to carry it out with the intent of Congress and what they're looking for, both in cost savings and the ability to make the military more effective. A couple of quick hits from my background on BRAC. Again, I worked it when I was in the Air Force and then on the committee, and then ultimately now serving in a new capacity. I've been in the job for 3 weeks. 2 of those weeks I've been traveling. Just got back from 6 days in Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. So if I start to nod off here while I'm up on stage, it's because I'm still on Guam time. So if you could just go ahead and poke me, that'd be great. If you really look at it, the BRAC has been a great process for the Department of Defense to really take a look at itself, to stand back and say, okay, where do we need to go with military value? Where do we need to look at what is happening in the world of weapon systems, emerging technologies, and how can we best station our forces domestically in order to take advantage of those opportunities provided by installations infrastructure, as well as to maximize the effectiveness of our weapon systems and training. If you look back on it, Congress has also shared this position and provided an authorization for 5 previous rounds. So for those of us, or for those of folks who I hear say there's no way that Congress is going to authorize a BRAC, my response is they've done it plenty of times before. So I think ultimately Congress does believe in the value of being able to do conduct a process which is fair and transparent. If we look at also what the authorization provides, and again, we need to step back a little bit. People think sometimes that your commission is still in law, or that it is a standing authority. The only standing authority that the Commander-in-Chief has right now is to close military installations. Standing in the way of that is Section 2867, which provides a somewhat onerous reporting requirement that has made it very tough for the Secretary to actually get recommendations up to the Hill and have them considered. That's really what has resulted in a separate piece of legislation known as the Base Realignment Closure Act that allows for a transparent, open process for the Secretary to submit recommendations, develop them and submit them to the Commission, which will then take a look at them and then forward on to the President. The value of that particular piece of legislation to communities is immeasurable. Not that any community actually wants to suffer from a BRAC round or suffer from a closure, but if you look at the actual law, there's only about 20 pages that talk about how the Secretary will conduct the review and how the Commission will consider those recommendations. The rest of the BRAC law is actually a series of actions that allows communities to quickly redevelop the property. About 100 pages of abbreviated NEPA of authorities for the establishment of local redevelopment authorities, agencies, and also an opportunity for funding from the Department of Defense to assist in the transition. So if you look at it, standing back from what the department is trying to do, BRAC really does provide not just a fair and transparent process, but also a great deal of ability for the Department of Defense to assist those communities that are impacted by BRAC. So I think if you look at it from an objective standpoint, a community that is faced with a reduction of forces, or a community that's faced with the potential of being closed, of their installation being closed, they would prefer to do it under the BRAC process than under standard process where you would declare the property excess and subject it to Federal Property Disposal Act. If you go no further than to ask the folks in the communities surrounding Naval Air Station Sugar Grove in West Virginia, as they're still struggling to figure out what to do with that parcel. That base was closed by the Navy a couple years ago under authority other than BRAC, and they're still struggling how best to reuse that property. So with that said, the department has asked for a request, an authorization to conduct a BRAC for the last 5 years. In the past, the request was based on the justification that there might be an efficiency to be gained, there might be savings to be obtained, that BRAC offered us an opportunity to see where we might have excess capacity to go ahead and close or reduce spaces in order to eliminate the excess capacity, thereby saving dollars. No doubt that's a noble cause, and even in our administration, in the current request, that is one of the goals. But I have to say right now that the more important thing for us right now as the Department of Defense is the fact that we're undergoing a process within a department for the review and update of the National Defense Strategy. We're also looking at a whole new realm, an era of new technologies, new methods of warfare, emerging capabilities, and with fifth-generation weapon systems. And that really, for us, needs an updated basing strategy to meet an emerging and new national defense strategy. From the Department of Defense perspective, that is the sole and the primary reason why Congress allowing us the ability to look at our basing and to make prudent decisions on where to station forces in order to optimize their effectiveness. You go back to Secretary Mattis' 3 priorities when he took over as Secretary of Defense. He wants to address readiness concerns immediately. He wants to increase military capabilities, and he wants to enhance lethality. From my perspective, working for him, the BRAC process offers us the opportunity to address readiness by providing our forces the best possible ranges and installations for them to be stationed at. Allows us to consider where we might want to add capabilities to the Department of Defense, particularly domestically, and add force structure. Most of all, it allows us quickly and effectively to enhance the lethality of our forces by coming up with ideal stationing opportunities for combined arms in order to make ourselves more effective and more lethal on the battlefield. So I'll go ahead and stop there, but I just want to make it clear that for us, it's not just a matter of finding efficiencies. It's a matter of improving the military value and the effectiveness and lethality of our military forces. That's why we continue to push hard, and we support the Senate's attempt to try to get a BRAC authorization inserted into the 2019 Defense Authorization Act.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Fred, and the Heritage Foundation for having us here today to talk about a very, very important topic. And I'm certainly pleased to join with my colleagues, my former colleagues, Lucian and Andrew, in discussing BRAC. I recall in 1993, after I was leaving the first Bush administration, Bush 41, I received a call from Senator Strom Thurmond, who was ranking on Judiciary Committee. And I was ready to go back to California and practice law, and he says, I need you to be my staff director on armed services because we're going to save Charleston from the BRAC. Charleston Naval Shipyard was on the closure list, and I accepted his invitation to go back to Armed Services Committee. And I should have learned my lesson that if someone asks you to chair a BRAC, you just say no and you move on. But I didn't, and had that opportunity in 2005. And I just want to build on what Lucian said. You know, it's been, if a BRAC is authorized in 19 to take place in 2021, that'll be 16 years since the last BRAC round. And think about the force structure changes that have taken place, reductions in end strength in the Army, combat air wings, brigades, changes in technology, emergency technology, and how that impacts our defense establishment, changing threat environment, yet we still have that same footprint. At the same time, there's really a BRAC ongoing, but it's a BRAC under the radar screen, kind of a stealth BRAC. Of course, DoD is limited in what they can do in terms of closing military bases. But they're forced, because of budgetary constraints, to move people. So brigades are consolidated and other changes are taking place. And so you have a lot of bases with empty buildings that you need to heat, you need to cool. Dollars that could be better expended advancing our defense establishment on our national security concerns. So one could make the argument that indeed we need to have a BRAC. And of course, the men and women we charge with leading our defense establishment have been pleading for a BRAC for over several administrations, including, as Lucian indicated, the current administration has done so as well. 2005 was unlike any other BRAC in my view. Limited experience on the 1993 BRAC. In terms of major and minor closures and realignments, it was double the number of all previous BRAC rounds combined. 190 recommendations that really had 783 distinct closure or realignment actions associated with it because the way the BRAC recommendations were structured. And Secretary Rumsfeld made it very, very clear that this was not about cost savings, primarily about cost savings. This was about military transformation. And I'm not sure we carried the ball over the goal line, but we certainly moved it down the field somewhat. And unlike on other previous BRAC rounds, we were asked to evaluate recommendations at a time of ongoing conflicts in Southwest Asia, a stable or increasing force structure, where in the past, Force structure was declining back in 2005. In 2005, it was increasing. And the projected redeployment of 70,000 troops and their families from Asia and Europe. So that's the context upon which 2005 BRAC took place. A number of things went well. I was blessed to have a commission, three retired four-star flag officers, Army, Navy, and Air Force, 2 former cabinet officials, 2 former members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, who also served as Assistant Secretary of Energy and at the White House Office of Technology, really an expert in nuclear power matters, and a former retired 2-star Major General who was the head of the Air Force Nurse Corps. So indeed, the commission had some people of experience, and especially the flag officers of insight into the military, whose advice was invaluable to all of us on the commission. We also had an incredible professional staff who had served on previous BRAC rounds, detailees from GAO and the Pentagon who came over to work on the staff, working 24/7 for a period of time. And of course, I think, as Lucian also mentioned, it was an open, transparent process. You never take politics out of it. You never take lobbying completely out of it. But we tried as best we could to make it open, transparent, and apolitical. 183 site visits to military installations around the country, 40 hearings around the country and in Washington, and having to produce a report to be submitted to Congress. A number of things went wrong. When we were nominated for confirmation by President Bush, one senator wanted to kill BRAC, so he put a hold on all of our nominations. So we had to wait to get recess appointments. The day we received, or the day after we received this volume of information from DoD, the recommendations and all the data, they determined, oh my gosh, this is classified. When you consolidate all this information, it becomes classified. So we had to wait until it was declassified. And that took time. And of course, we only had 4 months upon which to act on all of these recommendations. Cost issues. I mean, the quantitative analysis that is done to determine cost and savings is based on what's the acronym COBRA model, cost of base realignment actions. The GAO found that it was a reasonable calculator to determine what the cost and savings were as you compare these various military bases for closure. But the problem was they underestimated the requirements. For example, they estimated implementation costs for new construction to be about $13.4 billion. It turned out to be $25.5 billion. They underestimated the information technology requirements that cost significant amounts of money to implement BRAC. And very importantly, they underestimated or overestimated the personnel costs savings by saying that if you close a military base and you move 5,000 people, well, you have 5,000 troops cost savings, but there was no reduction in force structure or end strength. Those people were just being moved. So the savings that they projected at $45 billion over, I think it was 10 or 20 years, I don't recall, really was significantly less. So those are some of the things that went wrong that I'm hopeful when the next BRAC round comes, those issues are identified and addressed.
Can I borrow your pen to write some of that down?
Sure. I'll conclude that. I think we're very blessed to have Lucian over as the Assistant Secretary for Installations, Energy, and the Environment, and knowing basically living BRAC as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as staff on the Armed Services Committee. So with that, I'll conclude and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Andrew? All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment for BRAC on the Hill, both big picture and in the current situation. I want to start big picture and sort of what is the logic of BRAC? Why did BRAC ever work? And why might it work again? I want to start actually with what I think is the key point, which is BRAC always is hard, and it's not popular. It's not something Congress likes to do, and so the key element is that there has to be a champion. There has to be someone in Congress who is highly respected, who is really taking this on and pushing it forward, and of necessity that needs to be someone who chairs one of the two Armed Services Committee, because that's the position you need to be in to really serve as a champion. And in the past, various folks have served that role. The last 2005 round, it was really Senator Warner who served that role. And what is interesting and notable, and I think very significant this year, is that we have a champion who has stepped forward, and Senator McCain, along with his colleague Senator Reid, the two of them together, to serve as a champion. So that is a really critical, and I would say the critical event. And I should recognize, obviously, Congressman Smith has been there for some time as a ranking member and has been pushing the issue, and which has been incredibly helpful and kept it, moved the process forward. But as a ranking member, he hasn't been in a position to really push it through. And that's a key element that's fallen into place this year. The basic formula that the previous BRAC rounds have operated on is that they start at the level of theory. And so the authority is granted when there are no specific winners and losers. The authority has been granted when in theory everyone could be either a winner or loser. Now in reality, a lot of members of Congress either know or believe that they have a target on their back when it comes to BRAC, and they think their facility is at risk. And by the way, there are winners in BRAC, although we tend to think of it as a losing game. I happen to work for one member of Congress during my stint on the Hill, Norm Dix, who gained out of every BRAC round, gained substantially out of every BRAC round. And interestingly enough, to Lucian's point and to Secretary Principi's point about stealth BRAC, the one facility that didn't benefit from BRAC and lost a lot of work, which was the shipyard in his district, just because the Navy got smaller, so of course the shipyard got smaller. They never benefited from BRAC, right? Because there was no BRAC action that led to the Navy getting smaller. It was just a decline in the number of ships. And they lost half their personnel and never received any economic assistance as a result of a 50% decrease in their scope, because that wasn't under BRAC. But under BRAC, his district was always a big gainer in terms of Fort Lewis, McChord Air Force Base, and other facilities in Washington State. So there are winners in BRAC, and in many cases, the folks who are likely to win know who they are. But one of the key formulas has been that the BRAC authority is granted before the winners and losers have been definitively identified. Then, when the recommendations come back from the commission, it's an up or down vote, and the vote is to disapprove. You're trying to stop something that's in process rather than affirmatively voting to close someone else's base. You're just voting to keep the process going. And generally speaking, the political, the winners in the process have been able to just say, the process worked its will. It's not that we're greedy and we're trying to disadvantage our colleagues, but this is the process. And all we're doing at that point is supporting what's already underway. I'll circle back to that point when we get to where we are with in today's, the current situation in Congress. Congress has, in recent years, obviously really struggled to cope with BRAC, the idea of a new BRAC round. A number of objections have been raised. Obviously, the upfront cost during a time when the Department of Defense was hit with a very sudden spending reduction in 2013 as a result of sequestration in the Budget Control Act. Obviously, there was a strong logic for saving money, but one of the big concerns Congress had is right now, the first few years of sequestration are when the budget was the lowest and there was the biggest cut. And that's when there actually would have been increased costs as a result of doing a BRAC round if they had done it at that time when the department started requesting it at that point. And so the idea that funding is the shortest now, but you need us to give you money today to start closing bases, which we don't really want you to do anyway, that was not a political winner at that time. So upfront cost has always been a concern. Obviously, the concern of economic impacts in the communities and job loss has been a huge concern for members of Congress. As I mentioned, though, that's tempered by the fact that there's only a relatively small number of folks whose bases actually get closed. There's a small number of losers for whom that concern is really acute. There has been traditionally a concern, in fact, BRAC originated out of a concern about politicization in base closures. That remains a concern. Every BRAC round, folks have found a way to detect a hint of politicization, whether it's really there or not. In the process. And it's one reason why this issue of military value has always been so profound, that the recommendations need to be based on military value. And that gets a little complicated, as Secretary Principi indicated, when you have to crunch the numbers to determine, well, who, can we turn this military value thing into a number that we can then compare to costs? It's a tricky thing to do. And then the other issue that's been very concerning to a lot of members of Congress is the idea of capacity loss. You know, the theory going that once you give up land, you'll never get it back. Now, again, Lucian didn't make this point directly, but, you know, the history of the department says that, in fact, the department has acquired land from time to time over its course. There's nothing that says, as a first principle, that once you give something up, you'll never get it back. But that's generally the theory that Congress has operated on. And so even where there's been a fairly obvious mismatch between force structure and base structure, Congress has always still said, well, but, you know, that's only today. You know, what about 10 years from today? What about 20 years from today? Doing a BRAC is an irrevocable decision that we can't come back from if we determine later that our needs have changed, and we've got to move forward. And as Lucian very clearly explained, that argument actually works both ways, because you can develop this mismatch between what we need today and what we have in terms of infrastructure, and I agree with him that we are there. So let me talk a little bit about where things stand on the Hill. And as I mentioned, that the key fact, the most overriding fact, is that we now have a champion, in fact now 3 champions, 3 out of 4, with the senior leaders in the Armed Services Committee. Doesn't guarantee that they can get their members to go along with them and vote for it, but it's definitely a sine qua non for a BRAC round actually coming to pass. There was a vote on the House side. I don't think it was a terribly perfect predictor as a vote of where the votes actually are in the House, but there was an amendment to the House version of the Defense Authorization Bill on a McClintock amendment that was to strike a section in the bill that has been there for a number of years. It says, nothing in this bill shall be interpreted to authorize a BRAC. That was really, I guess, protective language, because there is other language in the bill, because there have been prior BRAC rounds, some of which are still being executed, that talks about, you know, authorizing BRAC activities. And they just wanted to make it really clear, hey, that's the old BRAC rounds. There's nothing in here to do a new BRAC round. As Lucian, I think, very clearly illustrated, BRAC legislation is over, you know, it's 200 pages long, and so I think it's a bit of a stretch that anything in the bill would be interpreted to authorize a BRAC, but that language was there nonetheless. And I mention that only because I think the voting against that and striking that language may not mean that someone is irrevocably opposed to BRAC. I think it was relatively easy for a member to say, hey, this language is pretty harmless, why do we need to strike it out? But the vote was 175 to 248. It was pretty balanced between Republican and Democrat. So there was support in both parties for striking that language, and a significant amount of resistance to striking it. The one thing I would say as a longtime House staffer is, unlike in the Senate, where each vote is its own struggle to get one vote, votes in the House tend to come in blocks. They don't come one by one, they come in 10s and 20s, because like-minded members tend to vote together. And you have regional groupings that vote together. And so generally, if you turn a vote in the House, you haven't turned one vote, you generally turn 10 to 15 votes, sometimes as many as 20 or 30, depending on the size of the block that you're working with. And so I would say that vote, 175, you need 218, is only about 2 to 2.5 blocks away from becoming a yes in the House. And that's really not that far when you think about it, if you can address some of the current concerns that Congress has had. So I think it's not necessarily that far away in the House, with the leadership in the Senate coming along board. And I should say, historically, it has always been the Senate that has taken the lead on BRAC, has made it happen. And I don't see any reason to believe that's likely to change. That there is real hope this year that they might be able to get there. Now, the other point that I think is worth making is that the Hill did, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, authorize the department to do the excess capacity analysis. That has now become one of the major justifications or bases for the request for BRAC, showing that there's 22% excess infrastructure. So that also was a bit of a weakening in the resistance in Congress to the idea of a BRAC. One interesting thing about that is that of that 22%, almost none of it is Department of Navy. The Navy really essentially took a knee on BRAC, said, we think we've probably done enough. And notwithstanding that there were some recommendations in prior rounds that never were executed or that were turned down by the commission, where you might have thought the Navy would think to go again, but the Navy is very good at detecting clear messages, and I think they saw that handwriting on the wall. So really the excess capacity is in the Army and the Air Force. Now, I'm not sure what political dynamic that has. It may free members who represent naval installations to feel more favorable to BRAC. It may make them, it's hard to know the political dynamics of that. It may make it less compelling because there's less opportunity to gain. There's not going to be as many Navy winners as there have been in the past. So I'm not sure the political dynamic of that, but I suspect it's significant that the Navy didn't really identify any excess capacity. The last thing I'll say is that, BRAC was really the cure for this overriding concern about politicization. And really, to some extent, the cure was perceived to have become the disease. People felt like the BRAC process itself had become problematic. And so both in Congressman Smith's version of the bill that he has introduced and has done for several years, and now in the draft that Senators McCain and Reed have released for discussion, they've tried to address this idea that the cure needs to be the cure again and not the disease. And so fundamental questions that the Hill is likely to work on is this question of there needs to be an independent arbiter in this process to make sure that politicization hasn't crept in. Should that be another BRAC commission, as it has been for the previous 5 rounds, or should it be some other process? And the Senate has proposed essentially using GAO as an arbiter to validate the analysis, and then letting Congress itself make the final call about whether they think the round is correct or not. One of the issues about that, as I mentioned earlier, previously they've always had the initial vote when there were no winners and losers, and then it was just essentially defending that position later on. In the Senate's formulation, essentially, you would know who the winners and losers were when Congress is being asked to vote for it. Now, as I mentioned, there's a relatively small number of losers, and so that could certainly work. But in the past, the theory has been when you know whose bases you're targeting with your vote, and that may be your friend, that may be your colleague, someone who's an ally for you on other issues, it makes it harder, even for those who aren't affected by BRAC to vote for it. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to see. And I'll stop there and let us move on to the question portion.
Thanks, Andrew. One of the things that Andrew brought up that I think is especially interesting that Lucian can address it is the capacity analysis done in March of 2016. It's a document that has served as the crux of all the arguments on quantifying the excess capacity. Secretary Niemeyer, would you mind talking about what does the document say and what does it not say, and what are the limitations?
Well, there's been a concern and questions by Congress for many years. Okay, what are you really using as the analysis to justify your request for an authorization? And when I was on the committee staff working for Senator Warner, Senator McCain, we asked kind of the same questions. And the concern was, at a time where we're looking at a growing rift or a growing distinction or difference between the threats we face as a nation, the strategy we've developed to address those threats, and then the forces we are providing on behalf of our nation to meet that strategy. There's a concern there that we were kind of not necessarily taking into account the full range of threats or really using a BRAC request as an underpinning of a strategy. So for a few years there, Congress asked for, hey, can you provide us a little more justification on why you think you have excess capacity? And it really is difficult for the department to do that without actually conducting the BRAC round. So what Congress has been asking us, hey, give us the analysis without actually, before we give you the authorization. And the response from Congress is, from the Department of Defense, we really need the authorization in order to be able to do the analysis. And we have an off-ramp. I mean, people don't realize the law does provide that if the Secretary of Defense, after the first year of analysis, looking at the force structure, looking at the defense strategy, looking at what we have for threats around the world, decides that, you know what, I've done the analysis, I really don't believe it's worth the expense or we're going to find the savings or we need to continue, then he certifies to Congress and he does not believe a BRAC should go forward, and it stops. I think folks have forgotten that. That has always been in the law, and it still exists in the proposal. So what Congress was trying to do is get a better understanding for where the department feels it's at. And it's really difficult for the department to be able to do that detailed analysis without causing concern, without creating hysteria out there as far as what they're actually looking at as far as bases. There has been done no analysis until we get an authorization. There will be no analysis accomplished until we do until we get an authorization. The idea, the notion that there's a list of base closures running around the Department of Defense is absolutely false. Still, Congress persisted with the legislative request in the 2015 Defense Authorization Act to try to give us something. So the department undertook a process trying to grapple with, okay, how do we do this without necessarily starting a BRAC analysis? They came up with an idea to take a look at the ratio of forces existing in, was it 1989, 88? Look at the ratio of forces to infrastructure we had then, and then go ahead and apply that forward to current force structure. The original analysis was done looking at what then the Department of Defense in 2016 felt like the infrastructure would be in 2019, although the Congress actually asked for it to be applied to a force structure that existed in FY12. The department sent over the first report to Congress in April of 2016 that showed 22% excess capacity across all DoD based on that ratio of analysis. So looking at it objectively, and I think this is ultimately what Secretary Mattis did, is I'm looking at, okay, in 1988, was that really the right ratio of forces to infrastructure? And then is that now become how we apply this forward? I think that's some of the concerns that he raised in her testimony earlier this year about that capacity analysis and whether we really do have 22%, 25%, 28% in the Air Force. I know there's some concerns that still exist about that. Still, we tried to do the best we could. The department tried to do the best we could with the authorities we had and to come up with what we felt was the best guess. And that's ultimately what you saw delivered to Congress. First in April 2016, now Congress is asking us to update that report and to accurately reflect what they originally asked for, which is an FY12. We're in the process of working that package back to Congress.
Thank you. One of the things that gets brought up multiple times is the 2005 round was uniquely transformational, that there was that emphasis on jointness. And one question that I personally have is that if BRAC is the adequate venue to do this transformation. And I think that Secretary Principi would be able to comment on it if that is the appropriate venue to do those transformations and to emphasize jointness. And a lot of the answer to that starts with what other instruments does DoD have? Would you mind commenting on that, Secretary Principi?
Sure. Transformation is not synonymous with jointness. Transformation is not synonymous with co-location. If you look at the 2005 round, many of the recommendations we received were within each service. There wasn't that much cross-service integration, if you will. There was some, but clearly that wasn't overriding. So I think it is an opportunity for Secretary of Defense to move that ball down the field in terms of true transformation of our armed forces to get really more operational effectiveness in joint warfighting, training, and readiness. But clearly, the cost savings has to be an important factor, and whether that is raised to be one of the military value criteria is really up to the Congress. It is not a military value criteria. It wasn't in 2005. Important, yes, but again, as I indicated, it was a clear charge to the Commission that the Secretary Rumsfeld was really more concerned about this transformation of our military and how it was structured. And going forward, I think it's going to be an important factor, but I also think that cost savings is going to be equally important, if not more important.
Can I comment on that? Sure. So I've been wrestling with the term transformation too. I think that was really a product of where the Bush administration was trying to get with the round. It's also a great way to separate where the previous administration, Obama administration, wanted to go with the round, which is they want to be efficiency-based versus transformational based. I'm not sure how you can do one without the other. I think every BRAC opportunity offers, a BRAC authorization offers the opportunity to look at better ways to do things. If you call that transformational, so be it. What I really am much more concerned about is how do we enhance lethality and enhance readiness. We ultimately have the stationing of forces right now in the United States that may not be ideally placed in order to be able to get to the readiness they need every day. It's really difficult to have to send our military forces somewhere else in the United States to train when they're already deployed, for 1 year out of every 2 or 3 years. We need to look at how do we ultimately station those forces at locations that they can do more effective, more efficient, and a wider array of full spectrum training close to where they actually live and where their families are. Those if you call that transformational, okay, fine. Then we'll have a bit of transformation. I look at that as just increasing readiness, increasing lethality, where we position weapon systems to have best access to the most ideal ranges for that weapon system. I'm not sure that's transformational. I call that just to be able to make sure that our weapon system is ready to go and when the balloon goes up. So I would say point that more towards lethality. So as opposed to putting a label on what this round's going to be, what that round's going to be, I think really what we're looking at is as a round that will allow us to take a national defense strategy, look at how that informs military value. Because coming out of our national defense strategy, we'll have a clear indication of what the military value needs to be for installations and applying that military value to the stationing of forces. I think really to me that is what we should be focusing on.
Thank you.
Let me just
go ahead.
jump in on that. I think this is really a key, maybe the key point, because I was always a little concerned with the Obama administration saying it's all about savings, because the nature of the legal restrictions on moving people and on moving and on closing facilities mean that the department is very sclerotic. It is very limited in what it's able to do aside from outright closures or reductions in force in terms of optimizing its use of its assets, its base infrastructure. And so the department is not typically thought of bases as assets. In a lot of cases, it just boils down to cost. And so this idea of whether a next BRAC would be to optimize our strategic posture or just a savings drill, those are two essentially fundamentally different exercises. Not unrelated.
They are, but I'm a military guy, and I'm responding to my Secretary of Defense that says we're going to save money in the next BRAC round, and by golly, we're going to save money too.
And you can save money. And like I said, optimizing, there's a cost savings, certainly opportunity there to be had, but it's a very different going in point to say this is for strategic posturing versus saying, we've had a budget cut and so we're going to go find some savings.
One of the questions that I wanted to pose you, Andrew Hunter, is on the resistance that Congress has been showing to authorizing a new round. You start talking about 4 different things, if I'm not mistaken. Costs, economic impacts, the political process involved and how that becomes about politics, and the capacity that they hold. How much of those concerns are real concerns that need to be addressed through changes in the BRAC process, and how much are those simply excuses to avoid a painful process?
Well, I think they're all real at some level. I would say none of them is illegitimate as a concern at all. I would say of all of them, the upfront cost one, it is factually true that there's an upfront cost. It is also, I think, in some ways the weakest reason to oppose BRAC because, if your answer is, well, I can't vote for BRAC because there's an upfront cost, then you're ungettable. Your vote is unobtainable. Because there's always an upfront cost involved. If that's your objection, then there's no way to get to yes. So it's the most problematic of the reasons for me for that reason. There are economic implications. Lucian has pointed out very correctly that the best way to address those is through a BRAC. That BRAC authority actually gives you the ability to work with communities and to reduce, minimize, or even ultimately reverse that job loss by utilizing that land base, that facility, through some other means. I get the wonderful opportunity every year to go out to Monterey and the Naval Postgraduate School for some work that we do there, and going past Fort Ord and seeing the development that has happened up and around. That's taken some time, but it's been a real success story. That would not have been possible if we hadn't had BRAC authority, if it had just been a decision by the department to close without any assistance to the community. So that's that job economic piece. To me, actually, you can turn that around and get people on board with BRAC because they stand to gain from having that authority. The politicization piece, That's kind of, if you will, where BRAC started, was trying to address politicization. It's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, to my view. I'm not sure I'm persuaded that there was politicization in the 2005 round, but I know there are some who feel that that is the case. There was a lot of outrage in 1997 when the Clinton administration said that they were going to privatize in place some of the facilities that had been on the BRAC round. I think actually history has somewhat borne out that decision, because there's still work going on in San Antonio that suggests that the economic rationale for staying there may have made sense. But I think that's really the tricky one. How do you deal with that? How do people feel comfortable that that aspect of politicization has been addressed? I think it's very doable. It's just a matter of how do you get the number of votes you need to make people feel that they can support that new process.
Hey, let me follow up on that a little bit, because for a few years there, I actually was part of the resistance in Congress to authorize around another BRAC. There's a couple of things here that we were paying attention to very much in the Senate Armed Committee when the department was coming over the BRAC request. First of all, there was a definite undercurrent that, hey, look, we're cutting forces, therefore we have excess infrastructure, therefore we need to cut infrastructure. Not everybody in the committee felt like cutting forces was the right thing to do. More importantly, a lot of folks felt like cutting forces was a result of budgets and not necessarily military strategy. A lot of folks in our committee felt that our military strategy was nowhere connected to where our threats were as a nation. So there was a feeling that if we felt like we were heading in the wrong direction with force structure reductions, there's no way that we would allow the department to permanentize them by reducing infrastructure. So there definitely was a concern of strategy, resources, and threats mismatch that kind of fueled some of the initial reaction to authorizing a BRAC. There also was a concern that we needed to change the law and update it, because there's no way anyone, to include Senator McCain, was going to allow a process to proceed that resulted in a $14 billion cost overrun in 2005. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but bottom line, that's an aircraft carrier right there. So my charge was, if we're going to even look at an authorization for another round, we have to update the law, not change it fundamentally, but update it in order to be able to put more cost controls, greater transparency, and a little bit more accountability into the process. And so that never came over from the Department of Defense. So that really was a huge sticking point, that we asked for improvements to the actual law, and those were not provided. Now, you do have Congressman Smith's version of the BRAC authorization that does contain some of those cost controls. Still working with my colleagues in the department to what degree those can be carried out. And that's something we'll need to take a look at moving forward to see what actually gets authorized. But those major concerns really kept us from even entertaining the idea, and it really is something that we need to look at. The law does need to be updated to allow for a more effective round, a more efficient round, without seeing the cost balloon up.
I would add that I think we need to keep in mind that many of the costs associated with my BRAC round in 2005 came after implementation. Just one example, the National Geospatial Agency facility was budgeted at $1.1 billion. The final cost of that was $2.5 billion. And you can go to Mark Center, you can go to the vast amount of construction, major military construction that took place after 2005 is just astronomical. You know, you might even say a little gold plating went into it. But clearly, you know, I think the commission implemented the law as it was drafted. I mean, we approved 86% of the recommended closures and realignments. That's the historical average. We did disapprove a number of major closures. Groton Submarine Base, which we learned was a center of excellence in submarine warfare. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, we learned, was the most cost-effective, productive shipyard in the Navy. They could turn around a nuclear sub. They could refurbish and refuel a nuclear sub faster than any shipyard in the Navy. The data that went into the Pentagon to justify that was used by the Pentagon to close Portsmouth was not the data we received. It was different. So I think that's one advantage of the commission itself. That's not to say you cannot have a BRAC without a commission. You certainly can. But we also work hand in glove with GAO, and they were detailed. We met with them. I met with the Comptroller General several times to talk about the recommended closures and realignment. So I think some of these costs came out after the implementation in 2005.
Hey, one last thing, Fred, on congressional resistance. For my time on the committee, in the entire 11 years, I pretty much met with every defense community in the country. And since then, since I left the committee in 2014, the last 3 years, I've talked about just about every state in the country. And I'm not so sure that there's not a growing realization that a BRAC provides more opportunities for bases than it does threats. I think if you go around the country right now and talk to defense communities, you see the majority of them, I won't say the overwhelming majority, but there's more and more communities and states willing to sign up and tell their delegations, yes, we want a BRAC. Because you've got bases with high military value that are only 60 or 70% utilized. They realize that, hey, they're ultimately going to get potentially stronger from a background. So I'm thinking you're starting to see a growing swell of support for what BRAC can do for an opportunity for those bases that feel that they have a significant contribution to national security. And that really is ultimately what it should be about. I mean, we're looking at those, the country should embrace a process that allows us to put our forces at locations that ultimately will provide the most benefit, the most effective force available at the most efficient cost. And so I have a feeling that congressional resistance, if senators and congressmen talk to their defense communities over the next few weeks to try to figure out where we're going to vote on BRAC, I'm hoping that the senators take the opportunity to talk to their defense leaders, communities, to talk to their adjutant generals. I mean, the National Guard, those adjutant generals who took advantage of the BRAC process in 2005 got really well really fast because they were able to close readiness centers that were underperforming in poor demographic areas, move over to emerging demographic areas. They were able to make themselves much stronger come out of their background. So as folks are listening to their tags, their defense communities, their states, I think you're starting to see folks say, yep, BRAC is the right time. We've been working for 10 years on improving our military value. We think we have a better product to provide the Department of Defense, therefore bring it on. We're ready for it.
Just very briefly, Lucian's point about the department not modifying their proposal. I guess my view is this is, again, why having a champion is so important, because really the department is not optimized to carefully craft or revise legislative proposal for this. I think the senator is, that's his skill set, and I think having a champion to actually do that work of improving the legislation, that's the key difference.
Thank you. I wanted to ask one last question to the panel before we open up for questions from the audience. Is there a better way to close facilities other than BRAC?
Secretary of Defense and
So I learned in my 3 weeks on the job, I take the hard questions, I pass them over to the old guy.
you hope in an ideal world our military leaders, both civilian and uniformed, can make those decisions with congressional oversight. Come up with some kind of format where you determine if there was some significant deviation from military value criteria without the need for a BRAC commission. But clearly I think it starts with the Secretary of Defense. I mean, he's the one who's charged with our national security, and I think perhaps increased authority, if you will. And again, there's no limitations on the number of military personnel that can be moved. Yeah, there are limitations in law with regard to civilian personnel, but you can move combat brigades, you can move air wings, you can do all of that, and it's happening. And it's the people that bring communities to life, not the buildings, not empty buildings, not with chain link fence around some Army installations, at least portions of Army installations. That doesn't serve the community very well. So I think the role of the Secretary of Defense is fundamental and very, very important in the decisions to close and realign military bases.
I guess in my ideal world, the law would be less rigid, and the department would have more flexibility to move folks, including civilian personnel, because it's hard to move large numbers of military without also affecting a relatively significant number of civilian folks. They would have more flexibility to optimize infrastructure to strategy, infrastructure to force structure over time. And, you know, I think it would be reasonable for Congress to say, hey, if you're going to go all the way to the point of closure of a major installation, check with us first, or there'd be some safeguards around that. But I do feel like the statute could be opened up, and it's been narrowed successively over succeeding years, saying, you know, reducing the size of actions that you can take without congressional approval. They could open that back up, and you might not need a full background again for a very long time. I mean, obviously, it's been a while since the last one. I would say we've needed it, though, for much of that time that we haven't had it. And I think you could make it unnecessary to have BRAC authority over longer periods of time if the law gave the department more flexibility to optimize.
Excellent point.
I mean, I think ideally you want to go back to what our founding fathers intended, and that is the commander-in-chief should have the ability to close or open bases as he or she determines to be in the best interest of national defense. I mean, I would love to go back to those days, and just have Congress at least be advised and maybe some type of consent. I think, really, you look at it, that's ultimately what the current amendment proposed by Senator McCain tries to get back to some extent. Now we'll see to what degree politics plays in that process, and unfortunately, that's what has happened in the last 20 years. Is when the Secretary of Defense has looked at a base closure, that it does ultimately involve jobs and politics. But yes, if I had an opportunity to do it again all over again, I would just like to go back to the discretion of the Secretary of Defense, advising the President of the United States that, hey, look, we probably don't need this base anymore. It's time to close it and save those dollars.
You know, one aspect of the McCain-Reed amendment dealing with the vote, as Lucian indicated, you know, or Andrew, in 2005, it took a vote of disapproval. Now it's, according to the amendment, if I'm correct, it requires an vote of approval. And is that going to inject more politics in it? Is that going to stop? Can any senator put a hold on the provision of law that establishes a BRAC? So that one aspect concerns me, how that would play out.
Not to mention that the Senate has a very empty calendar, that they have nothing else to consider. With that, we're going to open up for questions from the audience. Please ask your question in the form of a question. I believe we have a microphone. And please identify yourself. If you want to direct a question to anyone, also say so. Andrew.
Hi, Roxana Tiron with Bloomberg. Do you think BRAC is going to become the sticking point for national defense authorization in the Senate and going forward to conference if the Senate is successful in passing the McCain Amendment? Do you think it's going to be the sticking point?
I'll take a first crack at it. I guess my quick answer would be no. It's certainly true that historically it has played that role in the past. Former Chairman Bob Stump at one point got up and was ready to bail out on the NDA altogether as a result of BRAC, and Senator Warner got him back to the table, and ultimately they reached an agreement, but they came close. They came close to failure. It is not my sense that Chairman Thornberry is that opposed to BRAC, that he would literally walk away from the NDA. Now, I could be wrong, and I don't have deep insight. I haven't had a personal conversation with either him or his staff director on this point, but I don't sense that his level of resistance is at that, if you will, Bob Stump threshold of opposition. So I wouldn't see this being a bill killer. Well, I mean, the way they've structured it, and of course that was a decision by Senator McCain and Reed to hold the proposal back, not put it in the committee bill, and have it on the floor. Not to get us derailed, but there was another very controversial provision on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where they went a different route, and they put it in the bill in committee, and then it almost killed the bill because they couldn't get to the floor. But structuring it the way they have, look, it'll either pass or fail as an amendment. If it's got the votes to go in as an amendment, then it can't be a bill killer because it's got substantial support. So the way they've structured this, I don't see it being a huge barrier in the Senate.
Next question. There were a lot of hands before.
Thank you. My question's for Secretary Niemeyer. You mentioned that one of the improvements that's needed to the current BRAC law is the guarantee that there are certain cost controls that are put in there, especially after the 2005 round. I'm curious if you can just comment on the McCain-Breed Amendment as we were discussing and whether or not that contains some of those provisions that you're looking for.
It does. It provides an overall cost of implementation of I think $5 billion, if I'm correct. That is a good first step. I'm not so sure now that I'm on the department side that I would want to be capped by that. I was kind of hoping they would trust me as far as keeping the cost down. And there's also in the Smith version, there's also the requirement for the department to develop more detailed estimates beyond that of COBRA. I think there was an understanding that COBRA as a parametric modeling for doing scenario assessment was a very useful tool to be able to set aside certain scenarios and further pursue others. But at some point, you've got to move beyond COBRA and maybe do a little bit more engineering analysis of what a recommendation would cost. The Smith Amendment does provide for some of those requirements through the form of plans to be submitted along with the recommendation. Not sure to what degree the department can implement that. That's something that we would need to take a look at. But it really was, those are the types of things is trying to get Congress to be able to put some type of control. The 2005 round, unfortunately, Congress had very minimal authorization or ability to do anything about the explosive growth of the BRAC requests. And that's something that House and Senate are both wrestling with different solutions.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with Real Clear Defense. I wanted to ask Secretary Niemeyer about this whole idea that you want to optimize readiness and make that a big part of the analysis. Can you say who's involved in doing the analysis right now? Where does that stand? And when do you expect to have some actual recommendations on that?
Yep. So, I mean, we are not doing any analysis on optimizing readiness as far as installation. So we're not doing a BRAC analysis. Obviously, we're looking every day at how best to utilize our ranges. And we're also looking at to what degree our current ranges can support fifth-generation weapon systems. Those discussions are happening every day in the military. To what degree we can support the president's energy policy by adjustments in range policies or access to ranges. So there is a lot of discussion, and the Secretary has charged each of us to immediately address the readiness concerns that exist, not just in infrastructure, but also in training and manning, things like that. So there's a lot of analysis going on there. Now, how it would apply to a BRAC round, that connection has not been made because we don't have an authorization for a BRAC round yet. I think that would be one of the first things we'd want to do is look to see how readiness and capabilities are addressed in the new national defense strategy, and then take that national defense strategy, apply it to military value, and then start looking, okay, then how does that drive changes in infrastructure and ranges? So we have not done any analysis right now looking at realignments or closures or anything to do with any type of system or base. We are strictly looking at what infrastructure and facilities we have now and how to best use what we have now to maximize readiness. That's a good question. I think it's definitely on top of my mind. There is a lot of discussion going on right now within the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, and I'm not sure exactly when we're going to see that.
Can I just, I think this isn't, one thing I wanted to throw on the table, I think gets at this readiness, and certainly the range issue, is the opportunity potentially in a new BRAC round to look at the ability to do more public-private partnership and, cut down some of the upfront investment required on the government's end by having some private capital invested as well. And if you look at the ranges, training ranges, if you look at the DoD labs and you look at the T&E infrastructure, these are real national assets, and they have value beyond just the military mission. And so we have an opportunity there to leverage and not just improve, not just make a one-time improvement to readiness, but an ongoing improvement by bringing in some private capital that would get some access to these national assets in return. I think there's a real opportunity there in this round. And so I'm hoping the language is flexible enough to make those opportunities viable. And one of my concerns about the approach of the last administration, which was all about savings, is you couldn't maybe do some of those more creative things.
And I think it's also pre-BRAC. I mean, public-private partnerships is a great way to reduce operational cost, whether it's in services, building joint cogen plants that serve the grid in the community, serve the military base. There are lots of ways that the military can save money and partner with the community to advance some of those services and better position the installation to survive a BRAC round.
One of the underrated elements that I think it's under discussed is how fragile a BRAC process is for the sheer amount of off-ramps that you have throughout the process. And I think it was Secretary Niemeyer that started talking about that. After there is an actual study to assess the capacity and matching that to the force structure, if Congress thinks that that's inadequate, it can just stop the process there.
Slight clarification,
Yeah,
the Secretary of Defense can stop the process.
Mhm.
Once a BRAC is authorized, then yes, Congress can unauthorize a BRAC process. But the off-ramp I was talking about was once a BRAC round is authorized, the Secretary of Defense has the ability, has the prerogative to say, okay, now that I've done the in-depth analysis that you wanted me to do, and I don't see the reason why we need to go forward.
But in the same token, what almost happened in 2005 was that the commissioners were not confirmed, and if the commissioners were not confirmed, you would stop the authorization of the BRAC round as well. Like those type of off-ramps that I was referring that littered the legislation. Is there any other questions from the audience?
I have a question about the costs of the BRAC. There has been a criticism that the cost has escalated beyond what the estimates of the department were. In the previous BRAC rounds, in the previous 5 BRAC rounds, environmental remediation was not considered one of the costs. There seems to be an indication or an effort, certainly in Senator McCain's amendment and in some of the House language, that environmental remediation would be included as a cost. In the past, this has had, essentially 2 implications. The environmental costs have just skyrocketed. They're unknowable, as Secretary Principia said. It's one of those costs that has gone up, and you never know that until you open up the ground. Now, environmental costs were not included in the previous rounds because it was considered a governmental responsibility. Government's got to clean it up whether the base is open or closed, so it's not a unique cost to BRAC. And secondly, if you include it, then there's a tremendous bias to only close clean bases. Because you put one shipyard on the list, like Mare Island Shipyard or Hunters Point, you've blown your $5 billion cap right there. So should environmental remediation costs be included in the process?
Well, let me begin from 2005. Apart from the 4 military value criteria, you have the 4 economic criteria. One of those has to do with environmental remediation, but the remediation is not to future uses like redevelopment to a residential community. It's clean up to its current use, military use. But you're absolutely right. It's not for redevelopment. You're going to close a military base, and it's going to be redeveloped. Like we've talked about, there is life after BRAC in many, many places. Those costs have to be borne, if you will, by the community or the developers that are going to come in and redevelop San Diego or redevelop Newport or redevelop whatever it might be.
I take a little bit different perspective. From my understanding, the reason why the department in the past set aside environmental costs because you did not know. You would have to anticipate what the proposed use might be, and that would get into a whole discussion with the community that you weren't prepared to enter into while you're doing negotiations. Also, I think that there really wasn't enough environmental data available in the previous rounds of BRAC. I think the Department of Defense has done a tremendous job over the last 10 years investigating what they have on their military bases. And I think what you really look at in the proposed legislation is at least accounting for an environmental baseline study in the preliminary analysis and determine what you have and to make some rough order magnitude of what you might have to clean up those costs. But I agree, it would definitely disadvantage the sites that are clean and the bases that are clean. It would definitely advantage the sites that have a lot of cleanup. So I think the department we still have work to do on to what degree would incorporate that into the COBRA analysis, or to what degree would incorporate that as a final element in assessing the recommendation.
And now, one last question.
We almost done.
Hi, thanks. Travis Tritton with the Washington Examiner. I think Chairman Thornberry has talked a bit about the upfront costs, which you suggested puts people in this ungettable vote category. So I'm wondering if you see his opposition as being a key, if not the key hurdle, and whether you think that there's any possibility of some type of a political compromise between Chairman Thornberry and, say, Chairman McCain and the Democrats on the armed services.
Yeah, I think there is room for a compromise. And, I think, as Lucian's indicated, the idea of capping the upfront costs, or at least scaling it in some way that Congress can then control. So maybe they could set a cap, and if the department came back and made a really compelling case that actually if you gave us $18 billion of upfront cost, we can spread it out and it's really going to pay off in the long run. We can do a lot more useful stuff. Then Congress could obviously revisit that number in a future round. But I think the idea of setting some kind of an ability for Congress to have some measure of control over how much they're putting in terms of upfront cost and ongoing cost, I think that is the basic grounds for a compromise on that issue. And it could be very limiting depending on how it's written, how hard of a cap it is made. But I think it is the ground for a reasonable compromise between the two sides on that issue. I didn't mean to imply that I think Chairman Thornberry is an ungettable vote, although ultimately he may never want to vote for this. But there's a big difference between not voting for something and saying I'm willing to torpedo the whole bill over it. And so I don't think that the threshold is not to turn Chairman Thornberry into an enthusiastic BRAC supporter. It's just to making it something that he can live with.
Also, as a veteran of 11 National Defense Authorization conferences, there's also the ability for him to give up on one thing in order to get something else. I'm not sure there's ever a conference where members of the Big Four, who are the ranking members and chairman of each of the committees, don't come away having had to take on an unsavory provision that they didn't particularly agree with, and either because they had to do it for the sake of the bill or they were able to get something else in return on a compromise.
With that, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys coming over and speaking to us about BRAC. I think we have sandwiches outside, or no? I don't. Sorry. Either way, thank you so much for coming over, and please join me in a round of applause to our panelists.